Greetings hobbyists, this is Artisans of Vol, and in this video we're testing out some different 3D printing resins. Since having done a review of some filament, I thought it'd be a good idea to do one for some resins as well. So I went onto Amazon, had a look at some different companies with a wide range of resins, and picked one that I thought you might not have heard of before that would be worth reviewing. So I ended up going with Nova3D. They have a wide range of different resins, and I've just gone for 3 different ones that I think should demonstrate some nice points about the different resins, and also give you a good idea of what to look out for when selecting and testing resins yourself. Nova3D were also very generous and willing to give a 15% discount code that's going to come up at the end of the video as well, so stick around for that if you want to try some of these resins out. I should say that Nova3D did send me these 3 bottles of resin, but they're in no way paying me for this review, and all of my comments, both positive and negative, on these 3D resins is just my thoughts as I was going through and testing them. With that out of the way, I've set up a collection of different models that I've designed, and I'm going to be using those to test different characteristics of these resins. And these are the characteristics that are important to me, and they might be different priorities to you, so you can weigh them up as you want. What we're going to be looking at is the general affordability of the resin, how good detail it produces, and then finally its flexibility and durability, which is really important if it's going to be put under some sort of stress or strain. Now I think it's about at this time I should mention that the Meca resin and the Tough resin are actually water washable resins, which means you can shockingly clean them in water. I did give that a go, and you can see that here using a sonic cleaner, and even with me going in and trying to move everything around quite a bit, I just wasn't very happy with the results. And I even tried to go through and get some of the goop out with things like toothpicks. And I found that with water washable resins, I just don't think they do what they're really meant to. And that's regardless of whatever brand they've come from. So all of the imagery you're going to see, other than when I talk through it very specifically, is going to be for these resins cleaned using IPA, and that's what I always recommend using. So we'll start with that Meca resin as the first one we'll look at, and this is the results of this when cleaned with water. And as you can see, by itself, and even with a toothpick, it doesn't really get all of the resin out of the deep recesses, and that's my big problem with it. I mean, it's fine for things like the rivets, which you can just about see here in these larger rivets at the front, but again, any of these indents or engravings just don't seem to get the resin out with the water by itself. Now you can buy wash and cure stations which have a vortex in them, and maybe that's the solution to this, but that just then adds an extra cost that I'm not really taking into account in this video. I'd also say that you can run it under a tap, but bear in mind that water washable resin is still just as toxic as any other resin, and that gives the other issue with water washable resin of what do you do with all this water once you've got it. IPA will just evaporate very quickly, but you don't have that as much with the water. It takes forever to evaporate, so it's just an annoyance. As I say, I really can't stand it. I will stick with IPA whenever I can. Now this is the exact same Meca resin when washed in IPA, and I've just used my little sonic cleaner exactly the same. It just cleaned up really nicely, and you can see how sharp this detail is. There's very little to complain about here. It's giving me everything that I want for these small scale miniatures. And if I jump to this 28mm scale model, sorry, the focus here is just very difficult to get on these small miniatures, but all of the iconography and the tubing is absolutely brilliant. If I show you a photo of this gives you a really good idea of what this is doing. Now let's jump over to that Toughness resin and have a look at that, and we've got some pretty good detailing here, but it's definitely not as crisp as the Meca resin. It's a little bit more rounded at the edges, so it gets slightly less of a sharp edge. Now this isn't going to be particularly noticeable from a distance, it's just if you're going to do some really small scale photography that you might be a little bit concerned about that. At least for generally flat objects like hull plating like I've got here. Where this does start to fall down is on these really high detail miniatures, where you just get a little bit too much rounding for some of the iconography for me, but again, I'm a bit of a pedant about things like that, and you lose some of the really fine detail between the little ribbing that's underneath his breastplate here. But again, this isn't particularly bad. This is coming from someone who needs to take quite large scale photos for where he's selling files online, so the average person probably isn't going to have too much of an issue with this. But I think it is worth noting that it isn't quite as good as that Meca resin. Coming on to the other end of the spectrum, we've got the high detail resin, which is now called 8K resin, and this stuff is mad in terms of the detail that it can pick up. I can honestly say I don't think I've found a resin that is any better than this in terms of its detail. All of the edges are very sharp and very crisp, There are no detail issues in any engraving or raised detailing, and if we turn this on this side so we can see this cut in, I'll put my finger up so just to add a bit of contrast, you can see how well that has come out, with really sharp corners, and there'll be no issues in terms of painting there. The same is true of the infantry. The detail on this is very, very crisp, even crisper than the Meca detail again. So if really small, fine scale detail is what you're looking for, this is probably the resin for you. So if we bring that into our overall rankings, we can see we've got the Toughness resin lacking a little bit behind on the detail, the Meca in the mid, and the 8K just ahead, giving the crispest details. And if we quickly look at that 8K resin, which is on the left, versus that Meca resin, I think we can agree with that. It is just slightly crisper. Now in terms of flexibility, we'll just quickly mention that in terms of some of these larger pieces, and you can see this is the Meca resin, and it has a nice little bit of flex to it. And then the Toughness resin, unsurprisingly, has actually a massive amount of flex to this for what's quite a thick part. If we then have a look at the detail resin, this has almost no flex to it, but it's not that likely to break on these thicker parts, so that's not something that we need to be particularly concerned about. Now what is going to be interesting is when we start having a look at the smaller parts, and for that I 3D printed up some of these thunder hammers that I've designed. So we'll have a quick look at basically how much we can bend these before they actually snap. So we'll start off with this one. Let me just get that in focus, and this is our 8K resin. And we can see that if we apply a decent amount of pressure to this, there is no flex in it at all. It's rigid, which is beneficial for some aspects, but then it will snap as soon as you get past the point where it can't take the pressure being applied to it. Next up is our Meca resin. This is quite light grey, and this has a decent amount of flex to it. And finally we've got our Toughness resin, which will flex just like our Meca resin will as well. In fact, I think it flexes a little bit more on the thicker parts. And what's interesting, it has a little bit more spring back to it, so it's a bit better at going back to its original shape. We'll add that onto our scoreboard, and you can see now how important it is to determine what you want from your piece. With that 8K resin being much more detailed, but then the Toughness resin being more flexible and returning back to its original shape. And that presents you with a few different options. For example, that Meca resin is a really nice mix of both, with getting quite good detail, nearly up to the 8K resin, and having some very decent flexibility. So it might be you just want to buy one type of resin, and that's the one that you're going to use for pretty much everything you print. Or you're going to possibly look at doing what I do, and actually going to the effort of swapping out your resin and using maybe the detailed 8K resin for the torso and legs of a model, but you're going to use the tough resin or the Meca resin for the arms and the weapons, where you want that flexibility and you don't want to see them snapping. Finally, let's check out the cost of these resins and have a look at their affordability. Now, all three of these resins fall in the middle price category for resin as far as I'm concerned, with the Meca resin being $35.99, the tough resin being $29.99, and the 8K resin being $31.99, though at the time of recording this it was on sale. All of those are Amazon prices, and they're the best prices that I've managed to find online for these resins. And they seem pretty reasonable on price. I have found cheaper resins, though I don't think I found a cheap resin that does anywhere close to the level of flexibility that the Meca and Tough resin does. And those cheaper resins also aren't at the detail of the 8K resin, but it depends what you're looking for, and that's what you're going to need to prioritize. Nova3D have also given out a 15% discount code that's usable for the next 7 days from when this video is published. You can see that on screen now, and if you use the link in the descriptions, you can use that code to get those discounts. Now, do also remember that there are sometimes other things that you need to consider for this. For example, while I think the Meca resin for me is probably the best of all worlds if I was to only buy one resin, I also like taking photographs of my prints, and being a really pale colour, I find that quite tricky. So I appreciate there are other things that people are going to be concerned about, and I'll be really interested in hearing your thoughts on these resins in the comments section. Just remember, there are links to each of these resins in the description. They are affiliate links, which means they cost you no more to use, but they help support the channel by giving a little bit of money each time someone buys from those links, and that gives me the time to keep making more content. Hopefully you found that useful. If you did, hit that like button, and I hope to see you next time. Have a great day, guys.